Hello all, from my home to yours, grace and peace and health. And I have to say up front that I'm really proud that I picked a sermon title this week that actually has something to do with my sermon. You see, I usually have to pick sermon titles way before I start thinking about the sermon, so my title is usually just a guess about where my sermon will go. And I usually guess wrong. So there's this moment when I see my sermon and my sermon title, and I realize that they have nothing to do with each other, and I feel kind of guilty. But this week, let me tell you up front, is better than usual. My title actually applies to my sermon today. This week, my sermon is titled Sloth. Life, will you please stop bothering me? This week, I will be talking about the shadow side of the Enneagram 9, the peacemaker, and I'll be looking at a story from the book of Jonah. Let's start with that reading, but before we do that, consider pausing the video in just a second and pull up the scripture from today. It's from the book of Jonah, chapter 1. Before you do that, think about lighting a candle near where you're worshiping, or do something else like this to make your space feel like a sacred space. You can pause the video now to do that. A reading from the book of Jonah. The Lord's words came to Jonah, Amittai's son, "Get up and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their evil has come to my attention." So Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship headed for Tarshish. He paid the fare and went aboard to go with them to Tarshish, away from the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, so that there was a great storm on the sea. The ship looked like it might be broken to pieces. The sailors were terrified, and each one cried out to his God. They hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to make it lighter. Now Jonah had gone down into the hold of the vessel to lie down and was deep in sleep. The ship's officer came and said to him, "How can you possibly be sleeping so deeply? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps that God will give us some thought so that we won't perish." Meanwhile, the sailors said to each other, "Come, let's cast lots so that we might learn who is to blame for this evil that's happening to us." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they said to him, "Tell us, since you're the cause of this evil happening to us, what did you do and where are you from? What's your country and of what people are you?" He said, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were terrified and said to him, "What have you done?" The men knew that Jonah was fleeing from the Lord because he had told them. They said to him, "What will you do so that the sea will become calm around us?" The sea was continuing to rage. He said, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm around you. I know it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you." The men rowed to reach dry land, but they couldn't manage it because the sea continued to rage against them. So they called on the Lord, saying, "Please, Lord, don't let us perish on account of this man's life, and don't blame us for innocent blood. You are the Lord. Whatever you do, you can do." Then they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. The men worshiped the Lord with a profound reverence. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made solemn promises. So I've titled this week's sermon, Sloth, will you please stop bothering me? And we're looking at the shadow side of the Enneagram 9s, at their root sin, which Enneagram experts call sloth. And sadly, no, I am not talking about the cute creatures that hang from trees and move slow. The word sloth comes from an Old English word for slow. So sloth is kind of an arcane word that means something like laziness or reluctance to make effort or do work. However, the Enneagram experts are using sloth in a very particular way. When we hear that Enneagram 9s have a root sin of sloth, we're not saying that all Enneagram 9s are lazy people. And I'm not saying to you that you have to work hard all the time and feel guilty whenever you rest. In fact, in this season that we're in now, where we're having to shelter in place, I hope you have found some time to rest. Allow me to explain a bit about Enneagram 9s and what the Enneagram experts mean by sloth. First, the Enneagram 9s are often called the peacemakers. And I have to say, I really love Enneagram 9s. A few of the people dearest to me are Enneagram 9s. 9s are easygoing, relaxed people who are content with life. They really value comfort and contentment, both of which, mind you, are good things. And there's a shadow side to this too, though. Enneagram 9s have a tendency to sell themselves short and settle for something that's just fine, in order to having to avoid dealing with the difficult and potentially unpleasant challenge of having to see a job through. 9s can tend to be reluctant to take on challenging and potentially unpleasant stuff. In short, they tend to avoid. This posture of reluctance is what Enneagram experts call sloth, the shadow side of Enneagram 9s. Think of it like this. A few weeks ago, I got a Time magazine with Martin Luther King Jr. on the cover. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Enneagram 9s, however, tend to settle for the absence of tension, this false peace, as opposed to working for a deeper and more meaningful peace, God's peace. Or like what my sermon title says, 9s tend to go through life thinking, life, can you please stop bothering me? If there's anyone in the Bible that's a patron saint of 9s, it's Jonah. When God called him to go to Nineveh to tell him to change their ways, Jonah just really didn't want to be bothered. Life as it was going fine, and he didn't want to mess that up, so he decided to ignore God's request. Well, he did more than just ignore God's call. He did the exact opposite. Instead of heading east from where he was living in Israel to the city of Nineveh, which is in Iraq today, he decided to go west to Tarshish. Now, Tarshish is either in Spain or in Italy. It is definitely west of Israel. It's the strongest possible, God, please don't bother me response. Then Jonah is on a boat now, and there's a storm, and everyone on the boat is panicking. But like a good peace-yearning person that Jonah is, Jonah decides to take a nap. He decides to rest and pretend that the storm isn't happening. But he can only avoid the storm for so long, because the people on the boat come running down to Jonah and tell him that they fear the boat is going to sink and that something needs to be done. He's done his best to avoid God, but Jonah's avoiding of God has only made the problem bigger. With coronavirus right now, I feel like we're caught in the middle of a really big storm. We're in this strange, unsettling season of waiting. And I have to say, I'm not an Enneagram 9, but I am really ready for life to stop bothering me right now. I'm ready for some peace. I'm ready for this coronavirus storm to end and for life to become normal again. I've now been sheltering in place for 2 weeks. And over these 2 weeks, I have been learning a lot about how to best be church online and how to be church together without physically gathering. We haven't been using our building lately, but we're still definitely church together. Atonement is still your church community, and I am still your pastor. And when I haven't been learning about how to improve Atonement's online presence or otherwise working, lately I've been watching a lot of movies. And one movie I watched this past week is the 1979 sci-fi horror classic Alien. And after watching it, I read an analysis of this movie that speaks well to my experience of living amidst coronavirus. It's the waiting that's killing us. It's the feeling of being isolated and helpless that overwhelms us. It's the silence and uneventfulness that bring about the feeling of upcoming horror. It's this patience and restraint that makes the elements of pure terror so effective. By keeping the alien hidden from sight throughout the majority of the picture, we have to speculate, guess, and project what the antagonistic creature might look like. Because nothing is so powerful a generator of fear as the human imagination. And nothing is so terrifying to the human as the unknown. For me, some of the scariest parts of living amidst the coronavirus is living with the unknown of what comes next. I don't know how long we will have to shelter in place, and I don't know how many people will get sick. And I don't know how much this will harm the economy. I just don't know. And I find myself most anxious when I begin to use my imagination and to think ahead. Worrying like this, though, it doesn't do any good. Our worrying does not bring an end to coronavirus any faster, and it does not preserve our economy. All we can do is take life one day at a time. I don't know what our future holds, but I know who does hold our future. The future is in God's hands. The future is in good hands. God calmed the storms when Jonah was at sea, and God will calm the storms around us too. In the story of Jonah, when the storms raged and the sailors panicked and looked for someone to blame, the blame fell on Jonah. So Jonah was thrown overboard into the raging sea. Jonah and everyone on the ship assumed that this would be the end of Jonah's story. But Jonah's future was in God's hands. And God provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, to save Jonah. Jonah was then held in safety in the belly of the fish. He was safe, but he was in an isolated and enclosed place, and he didn't know for how long or what would come next. Doesn't that sound a lot like our life right now amidst the stay-at-home order? Well, God brought Jonah to safety, and God will also bring us through this. We're going to make it through this. Our future is in good hands. Our future is in God's hands. We're going to make it through this. Amen.